Hi, recording this on a Monday in May 2014, talking about the environment, globalization, and social change. So, not really until the 1970s did people in industrialized countries think that pollution of the environment caused a real danger to health and the future of the human race. That just wasn't part of our thinking. It was about making money, growing industry, and celebrating after decades of world wars and depressions. But in the 1970s, then people started to think about the impact that humans were having on the environment. And in a little bit, I'll talk to you about the origins of the environmental movement. So we're going to talk about two paradigms here. And this is really important because these two paradigms really dictate our economic policy depending on which government is in power at the time. So a paradigm is just the underlying way of viewing the world, or the way of thinking about the world. So there's two paradigms for our purposes. The first one is the dominant paradigm, and this is often used by conservative governments and is favored by people in business and industry, saying that humans have a duty to create material wealth to make this and future generations richer, and in order to do so, they can change or corrupt the natural world. So that the duty of this generation is to make money at whatever cost, whether it's cutting down trees, whether it's fishing out the ocean, it's about making money. In some ways, this reminds me of the health intervention model, meaning like that we just think that there'll be a cure for something. We'll have enough money and we can cure a disease. We can cure environmental disasters or environmental changes. And that's just the way I kind of think about it. But that we have a duty to make money to pass on to other generations. So very right-wing thinking, and that's okay. The other one, and the way it's articulated from the text, it is very left-wing, and sometimes I almost feel like hugging a tree when I read this, but I think there's more to it than that. So the alternative environmental paradigm says that society must place a higher importance on non-material things to encourage strong communities built on strong relationships and act with great respect in these relationships. So at the forefront is our relationship with the environment, and saying that no, the duty isn't to make money, it's to preserve this environment, and maybe the economy can coexist with the environment and maintain some environmental standards. So it is a little flowery. I think that might be a pun, but this would be left-wing governments saying and throwing environmental restrictions on. You have to cut your emissions. You cannot pollute this. And I guess depending on where you sit on the political spectrum, Ontario has some very high environmental restrictions. So, okay, that has presumably helped our environment or our climate, but has it hurt industry? And that's the point we'll look at in a second, is that if I'm running a factory, it's going to cost me a lot to abide by these environmental restrictions in Ontario, where I could take my factory to Malaysia, where they don't have the same sort of environmental restrictions, and then my production and my cost efficiency would increase. So those are the two types of paradigms that we are concerned with. So when the Kyoto Accord came out, this was, policy to reduce carbon emissions. Adhering to that would be a sign of the alternative environmental paradigm. Not abiding by that, or you know, the building of the Keystone Pipeline, that would be embracing the dominant paradigm. And sometimes it's hard to make these blanket statements. Some people may argue the making of the Keystone Pipeline is environmentally friendly, and maybe it is. You know, I'm not as up on the Keystone Pipeline as I should be, even though it's likely the most contentious issue in terms of environment and in terms of jobs that we have right now. Now, it usually takes some sort of environmental disaster to influence change, whether it's an oil spill. Um, okay, that's the only example that I can think of. Some massive oil spill or uh, whales I mean, washing up on shore, or habitat of polar bears decreasing. It usually takes some sort of disaster for us to pay attention and to then um, pressure the powers that be, to pressure the governments to change public policy. So, and I've noticed there's some major grammar errors up in that note, so hopefully you'll get what I mean. Um, the environmental effects of globalization. So, as we've spoke about over the last 5 days, is that globalization has caused more cross-border transportation, and we use more natural resources. If I'm an industry, like I've said before, I want to increase output to increase profits and better cost efficiency. And with that, often environmental impact is not a concern. But I'm sure there are tons of corporations out there who are concerned about environment and pollution and stuff. What comes to mind is Coke, when they donated money for every can sold, I think, to polar bear habitats. Was that good public relations, public policy? Yes, it was. How effective was it? I don't know. And like I've said before, large corporations rarely face environmental restrictions in the developing world. And as our global population continues to increase, as it approaches 7 billion, how are we going to feed this population? With extreme weather that we're seeing now, with extreme droughts, extreme heat, torrential rains, all of that, is our Earth going to be able to sustain itself in terms of feeding the population? And I don't know what your feelings are about genetically modified crops or genetically modified foods. Some suggest that that might be the answer, that they can make a strain of vegetables or a strain of rice that is drought resistant, that is flood resistant, and creates this high yield to allow smaller parts of gardens to produce more and more. Now, what's the long-term impact of constantly eating genetically modified foods? I don't know if we know the answer to that yet. So, again, I guess I'm providing more questions than answers, and I know that might be a little frustrating. The environmental movement. So, some have suggested the environmental movement in Canada started in the early 1900s when our government has started establishing our national park system and our nature preserves. See, I think inherently as a part of our heritage and our connection to First Nations people the influence of First Nations peoples on Canadian society, First Nations peoples have such a connection to the land, such a connection to the environment, that hopefully those things continue to get passed on from generation to generation, to value the environment, to value the land in which Canadians have. And sometimes I still, again, I feel guilty for the space that I use. Like our, what's it called, number of people in a given area. I can't think of that, and I'm having a big brain cramp. Population density. if you look at our population density compared to the population density of China, of India, we are very, very lucky and maybe greedy to use the space that we have. Now, some say in 1967, the CBC aired a documentary. Oh, sorry, pardon the pun. Air of Death, and this disclosed the negative impacts of air pollution on human health. In the 1970s, people began taking notice of the impact industries can have on the environment, so we're seeing things like acid rain, like smog coming about. In the 1980s, environmental groups were too far segregated and isolated, and these groups couldn't prompt social change. Now, eventually, we in Canada formed the Green Party and started to promote the values of ecological thought. Now, it seems as though the Green Party is still a bit of a fringe party in a lot of the debates, even provincially. I don't think the leader of the provincial Green Party was invited to debates. In terms of the federal Green Party, I still believe we do have one member of the Green Party that has a seat in Parliament. I think her name's Elizabeth May. So it still seems to be on the outside looking in. 1997, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change signed the Kyoto Protocol that set binding obligations to reduce emissions to greenhouse gases for industrialized countries. These emission standards were to be forced as of 2005. And I don't know what the penalty is for countries that don't abide by that. Like, what can they really do? And this is apparent here as the U.S. signed the agreement but never ratified the agreement, and then Canada withdrew from the agreement in 2011. So that shows the dominant paradigm. Now, we do have a conservative government in power right now, where their main concern would be less government involvement, more industry, more jobs, more capital gain, and if it requires altering the natural environment, then so be it. Now, I don't think they're going to pollute on purpose, but they just don't want the government, more government restrictions on property and such. And your parents might be frustrated by the amount of restrictions that you have when you're trying to build something, and the restrictions to build a structure by water these days. It is very, very difficult, and this would be an attempt to preserve our natural habitat. So I've alluded to this before, but the Keystone Pipeline will be established, or that is proposed to be established as a source of oil from Alberta to the U.S., is likely the most debated environmental issue presently. So this would be just a huge oil pipeline across Alberta into the southern states. And I guess that's going to disrupt some natural habitat. How much disruption? I don't know. Many suggest that this will create thousands upon thousands of jobs. But the question I have to leave with you then is it worth it? Is it worth creating jobs at the cost of the environment? Well, maybe someday if we have enough jobs, we have enough wealth, then we can hire scientists to maybe look at to study the effects or to reverse the effects of climate change. And that is very simplistic, but just something to get you thinking again. So that concludes the podcast on environment, globalization, and social change. Thank you for listening.